Now, by the 9th century, Viking marauders had plundered their way up and down the western edge of Europe and managed to conquer strategic fortified cities in the Basque region, such as Lapurdum or modern Bayonne. When the Basques managed to expel them a century later, they had nevertheless benefited from their naval expertise and knowledge of Arctic navigation that their Norse conquerors had disseminated over the course of several generations. They even redesigned their own whaleboats along Viking lines, which they called a chalupa, the design of which became the template for whaling dories right into the 19th century. They were also introduced to the gastronomic delights of their peculiar Viking dried stockfish, called skrei, a migrating fish known to us today as Atlantic cod, which would spawn off the northern coast of Norway before returning to colder waters of the Barents Sea. For thousands of years, the Norsemen would fish for these plentiful beauties and dry them in the cold Arctic air till they were as stiff as a plank and could be eaten like jerky, or rehydrated in any number of stews and dishes that wasted very little. Tongues, eyeballs, livers, roe, and even skins, swim bladders and intestines being considered delicacies in Viking society. While herring was a regularly available source of staple food, Viking fishermen increasingly began to favour the cod and travelled long distances following its migratory patterns. You see, shoals of herring were all very well, but were incredibly labour-intensive, and their oily meat was hard to dry out for long voyages. A single cod, on the other hand, could grow to over 6 feet tall. They were easy to catch and dried readily into lightweight cargo, providing a massive return on investment. So they followed them, all the way to America. The story goes that legendary Viking adventurer Erik Thorvaldsson, known as Erik the Red, grew up in Iceland because his dad, Thorvald, having murdered a neighbour during a dispute, was banished there as punishment. It seems that Erik was a chip off the old block, because when he was himself later involved in a similar dispute with neighbours, he dispatched them with the usual Viking aplomb, and took out their kinsmen for good measure too. Banished from sunny Iceland for the heavy sentence of 3 years, he and his merry men set out to investigate for themselves a new land that apparently lay to the west, which had been reported by a fisherman who'd been blown off course by a storm in 876 AD. Sure enough, they soon ran into a desolate, glacier and iceberg-strewn rocky landscape. But there were plenty of seals and whales around, and the cod seemed to be just as plentiful as they were back home. Erik the Murderer suddenly had an epiphany and promptly restyled himself Erik the Property Developer. Using his time in exile to scope out its potential, when he finally returned to Iceland, he spruiked this incredibly rich and promising new land of milk and honey to potential settlers who were having a hard time surviving a recent famine in Iceland. According to Erik, they should just drop everything and follow him over to this new, insanely fertile country he simply named Greenland, despite the fact that there was not a blade of grass to be seen anywhere. He must have been quite the hustler, because by the time they got there, half of the 25 colonist ships that accompanied him had been sunk in treacherous Atlantic storms, and the remainder, too traumatized to make the return voyage, set out exploiting the marine life, which at least meant they wouldn't go hungry. In fact, with the plentiful food supply, they managed to establish permanent settlements, and Erik became quite the tycoon, as the thriving settlements lived off the cod and processed whale, walrus tusk ivory, and seal skins for the burgeoning European market. It wasn't long before other wind-blown fishermen reported land even further to the west on which they saw trees for the first time. So Erik's son Leif keen to expand the family business into the lumber industry, set out on his own expedition, and within a couple of days made landfall in what is today Baffin Island in Canada. He reported enormous flat rocks near the shoreline, but no arable soil whatsoever, naming the area Helluland, from the Norse word for flat rock. Archaeologists have reported that a long-standing Viking base was soon established on the spot, complete with huts and workshops. Though fishing was plentiful, there was no woodland to exploit, so Leif headed further south, eventually coming to a forested area he named Markland, from the Norse word for woodland, today near Cape Porcupine on the Labrador coast. Here they harvested some timber and headed yet further south, coming ashore at a mild and temperate location with plentiful wild grapes, earning it the elegant name of Vinland, today presumed to be on the northern tip of Newfoundland. Leif returned to Greenland, laden with lumber, fish and grapes, and lays claim to being the first European to set foot in America. His compatriots would go on to send another 5 colonial expeditions to set up villages and exploit its natural resources. Anyway, by the 1050s, stories were filtering into Europe via Danish sources of a mysterious new land in the west, rich in timber, as well as animal resources in which the Vikings had made settlements. It's pertinent to note that none of this westward Viking expansion would have been possible without the dried cod stocks the Vikings carried aboard their open-decked longboats. Light, easy to stow, slow to spoil and highly nutritious, it made long sea voyages in open boats possible and could be processed much more easily than whale or seal meat, which required not only space but wood for smoking to preserve the flesh. Unfortunately for our poor, peace-loving Viking settlers, they soon got a serious dose of karma when local indigenous Beothuk tribes took a liking to their metal tools, domesticated animals, and Scandinavian wives, and out-Vikinged the Vikings, pillaging their settlements, causing the complete collapse of their colonial project and a hasty withdrawal back to Greenland. Rack one up for the Indians. The Atlantic cod, Gardus morua, is a very unusual fish. It has some of the lowest fat and highest protein ratios of any fish, making it easy to dehydrate and dense in nutritional value, which also helps prevent spoiling and makes it a perfect candidate for jerky. In nature it is incredibly long-lived, over 30 years, and breeds prolifically. A mature female over 15 years old will release over 9 million eggs in a spawn, and furthermore, the species is very hardy and resistant to disease. As an omnivore, the cod is highly voracious and will eat virtually anything it can hoover up as it swims lazily near the sea floor with its huge mouth agape. Fully grown adults, in the cold waters of the Arctic Ocean, have few natural predators until they come in close to shore. Cod has the whitest and flakiest flesh of any fish. Its muscular system is comprised mostly of fast-twitch muscles that are capable of explosive speed but poor stamina. This makes cod a lazy swimmer, meandering gently through the seabed currents, only making sudden moves when gobbling up prey. This muscular characteristic also makes them easy to reel up once caught, as they offer no resistance whatsoever. Atlantic cod are a complete disappointment for sport fishermen, who enjoy a proper battle on the end of their lines, which they only get from oily bluefish that dwell in the middle or the surface waters, such as marlin or tuna. When spawning, cod come in very close to shore, but usually they frequent the familiar deep-sea banks where currents bring potential food up from deeper waters. So once you know where they are found, it's easy money to fish for them. Early reports from this area of North America claim that cod were so plentiful you could walk across their backs from a ship to the shore. Indeed, it's been reported that you could barely row a boat through the mass of bodies at spawning time. American cod fisheries were a gold mine, just waiting to be exploited. The Viking foray into America marked the high water mark of their civilization. As they withdrew, their influence elsewhere also began to contract. Their leadership fragmented, Europe's defences improved, and the Vikings themselves began to assimilate into the cultures they conquered, most notably through their widespread adoption of Christianity in the early 11th century. Instead of raiding and selling slaves on the open market, they now sold cod.